shoes had a crack along the left sole. I noticed it that morning when I was getting dressed, and I thought about going back upstairs to find another pair. But those were the only dress shoes I owned. My daughter's wedding was at 2 o'clock. I taped the sole with a strip of duct tape, pulled my pant leg down over it, and drove to the church. The venue was beautiful. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter because that's what she was to me for 32 years, had always wanted something like this. Tall white columns, flowers everywhere. A string quartet that probably cost more than my first car. My son-in-law's family had money, real money. The kind that shows up in the way people carry themselves, the way they order wine without looking at the price, the way they look at you when you walk into a room. I walked into that room. I saw my son-in-law's mother, a thin woman named Adrienne, glance down at my shoes, then back up at my face. She smiled the kind of smile that isn't really a smile. I found my seat. My name is Gil. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years driving a school bus for the county, and before that I worked loading docks and did some contractor work on the side. My wife Loretta and I raised our daughter Becca in a 3-bedroom house in eastern Pennsylvania, in a town where everybody knew everybody and nobody had much but nobody talked about it. We never went hungry. We never missed a mortgage payment. Becca went to college on a combination of scholarships, student loans, and every dollar Loretta and I could scrape together. When she graduated and moved to Philadelphia and started working at a marketing firm, I felt like we'd done everything right. Then she met Brandon. Brandon was 35, a financial analyst, drove a BMW, and had the kind of confidence that I used to mistake for character. He was polite to me in the beginning, asked about my work, shook my hand firmly, called me sir. I liked him. I told Loretta I liked him. She looked at me for a moment and then went back to washing dishes and didn't say anything. Loretta had a gift for silence that I never fully understood until later. They got engaged after 18 months. The wedding planning started immediately, and it was clear from the first conversation that Brandon's parents were going to be running things. They offered to pay for most of it, which I appreciated, and I told them honestly that Loretta and I could contribute around $8,000. Brandon's father, a man named Philip, nodded the way you nod when someone tells you they can offer you a ride on a bicycle. I noticed. I didn't say anything. The months before the wedding, I saw Becca less and less. When we did talk, there was a new rhythm to her, a new vocabulary. She started saying things like, "Your side of the guest list, and the venue has a capacity issue, and Brandon's family has certain expectations." She wasn't unkind, she just sounded like someone else. Loretta noticed too. She sat with it quietly the way she sat with most things. In February, 8 weeks before the wedding, Loretta was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those 8 weeks because I still can't move through them without stopping. She was sick fast. The way that disease works, it doesn't give you time to pace yourself. 1 week she was making soup and asking me to fix the screen door, and then she was in hospice, and then she was gone. She died on a Thursday morning in April. The wedding was the following Saturday. I called Becca from the hospital parking lot. She cried. Brandon got on the phone and said they were so sorry and that they would handle everything. I appreciated that. I drove home and sat in the kitchen for about 4 hours without turning on any lights. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Some of Loretta's friends from church came over and helped. My brother drove up from Maryland. Through it all, Becca was present but fragile. She was grieving and she was stressed about the wedding, and I could see her trying to hold both things at once. I didn't want to add to it. I ironed my good pants. I found a dress shirt in the closet that still fit. I polished the dress shoes as best I could. When I noticed the crack in the sole that morning, I thought for a moment about telling Becca I couldn't come. Not because of the shoes, just because everything in me felt scraped empty. But she was my daughter, so I taped the sole and I drove to the church. The ceremony was beautiful, genuinely. Becca looked extraordinary. I watched her walk down the aisle and I thought about Loretta. About how she had saved a small cutting from her bridal magazine from when Becca was about 9 years old, tucked it in an envelope in her dresser drawer, and never said a word about it. I had found it 3 days earlier when I was going through her things. The cutting matched the dress almost exactly. I didn't tell Becca that. I didn't want to make her cry before the ceremony. The reception was at a hotel ballroom about a mile from the church. I found my table, which was near the back. close to the kitchen. I recognized two of the people sitting there, an older couple who were Loretta's second cousins, people I'd met maybe twice. The rest were strangers. The tables at the front were for Brandon's family. I drank a glass of water and watched my daughter dance with her husband and told myself this was a good day. Then Brandon's brother got up to give a toast. His name was Chad. He was 31, worked in finance like Brandon, had the same haircut and the same easy authority. He talked about Brandon's success, about the kind of man his brother had become, about how lucky Becca was to be marrying into a family with such strong values. I noticed he didn't mention Loretta. He didn't mention me. I told myself that was fine. It was his toast about his brother. But then he looked out at the room and said with a smile, and I have to say, we were a little worried when we first saw Becca's family. He laughed. The people near the front laughed. But hey, not everyone can dress for an occasion, am I right? He was looking at me when he said it. Not directly. The way people look when they want deniability. I sat very still. A few people at the surrounding tables glanced at me. I saw one of Brandon's aunts lean over and say something to the woman next to her, and the woman nodded and they both looked at my shoes. I felt the duct tape along the sole of my left foot as clearly as if it were a brand. My daughter was looking at the tablecloth. What could I say? What could I do? I was at my daughter's wedding. My wife had been dead for 9 days. I sat at that table and I smiled and I clapped when the toast ended and I watched my son-in-law laugh at something Chad said, and I thought, I see you now. After dinner, Brandon found me near the bar. He put his arm around my shoulder in the way people do when they want to look warm. He said, Hey Gil, look, about Chad. He's just a jokester, you know how he is. Don't take it personally. I looked at him. I didn't. He seemed satisfied with that. He squeezed my shoulder and walked away. I stayed for cake. I hugged my daughter. I shook hands with the people I needed to shake hands with. I drove home and sat again in the kitchen in the dark. And this time I wasn't just empty. I was something else. Something that had been quiet in me for a long time had opened its eyes. Here is what Brandon and his family didn't know about me. They thought I was a retired school bus driver with cracked shoes and $8,000 to contribute to a wedding. And that was true as far as it went. What they didn't know was that Loretta had been the careful one. Loretta had been the one who read every bill, tracked every account, invested steadily and quietly for 30 years without telling anyone, including, mostly, me. She grew up in a family where her father lost everything in a bad business deal when she was 12, and she swore when she was a teenager that she would never be in that position. She kept her word. She had started putting money away in 1991. First in a simple savings account, then in index funds when her sister's husband explained them to her at Thanksgiving in 1994. She maxed out her IRA every single year from 1998 onward. She had bought 3 rental properties in our county between 2001 and 2009, the last one for nearly nothing during the crash, and rented them steadily and quietly ever since. She managed all of it herself, from a laptop at the kitchen table after I went to bed in the same way she did everything, without announcement, without drama, without asking for credit. I knew some of it. I didn't know all of it. After she died, her attorney called me in the 3rd week of April. I sat in his office on a Tuesday afternoon, and he went through everything with me. The accounts, the properties, the life insurance policy she had taken out in 2008 that I had honestly forgotten about. I sat across from that man for 2 hours. When I left his office, I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a long time. Then I called my brother and I said, "You need to sit down." And I told him. And there was a long silence on the line, and then he said, "Gil, did you know?" "Some," I said. "Not all." He was quiet again. "Then, what are you going to do?" I thought about that question for a long time. Here's what happened in the months after the wedding. Brandon and Becca started coming around more. It started slowly. A Sunday dinner here, a phone call there. Brandon began asking questions. Had I thought about selling the house? It was a lot to maintain alone. Had I thought about consolidating, simplifying? He knew a financial advisor. He'd be happy to connect me. I said I appreciated that. He started mentioning the house specifically. He and Becca were thinking about the future, starting a family. They needed space. Our house had 4 bedrooms and a big yard and had been in my name since 1989. He said twice, both times casually, both times framed as concern for me. That carrying a property that size alone at my age seemed like a burden. The second time he said it, Becca was sitting right there at my kitchen table. She didn't say anything. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at her coffee cup. That was the moment, I think, when I understood what had changed. Not what had changed in Brandon. Brandon had always been this. What had changed was what Becca was willing to allow. The woman who had grown up in this house, who had come to me crying at age 16 after a hard week at school and sat in this kitchen while I made her grilled cheese. She was sitting here now and letting her husband suggest I should sell my home, 9 weeks after I buried her mother. I said, "I'm comfortable here." Brandon nodded and changed the subject. But he came back to it a month later, and the month after that. My brother came to stay with me for a week in July. We went fishing like we used to do when we were kids. One night on the back porch, he asked me if I'd talked to anyone about what Loretta had left. "No," I said. "You planning to?" I looked out at the yard. Loretta had planted a row of rose bushes along the back fence in 2015. They were coming in full that summer, red and pink, exactly the way she'd intended them. "Not yet," I said. My brother didn't push. He never does. That's why I trust him. In September, Brandon and Becca invited me to dinner. It was at a nice restaurant, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices on it, at least not on the copy they hand to one person at the table. We sat down and ordered drinks, and I could tell from the way they were behaving that they had a plan. They were careful. They were coordinated. Becca was quiet in a way that I recognized from childhood, the way she got quiet when she knew she was about to have a conversation she didn't want to have, but had already agreed to have. Brandon talked about the real estate market. He talked about liquidity, about equity, about how much the neighborhood had appreciated. He talked about the difficulty of maintaining a home alone. He said he and Becca wanted to be close by, wanted to be there for me. He said, and I remember this clearly, "We just want to make sure you're protected, Gil." I put my fork down. I looked at him. I looked at my daughter. I said, "I know what you want." There was a silence. I said, "I appreciate that you're concerned, but I'm not selling the house. I'm not moving. I don't need a financial advisor, and I don't need anyone to manage anything on my behalf." I kept my voice even. I want to be clear about that. Brandon's jaw tightened. "We're just trying to help." "I know," I said. "I don't need it." Becca said very quietly, "Dad, we're just worried." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. I thought about the bridal magazine clipping in Loretta's drawer. I thought about the crack in my shoe. I thought about Chad's toast and the way Becca had stared at the tablecloth. "Are you?" I said. She didn't answer. We finished dinner. We drove home separately. I didn't hear from them for almost 3 weeks. When I did hear from Becca again, she called me on a Sunday morning. She said she was sorry. She said things had gotten complicated and she hadn't handled it well. She was crying a little. I told her I loved her and that I wasn't angry. Both of those things were true, but I had also spent the previous 3 weeks doing something. I'd called Loretta's attorney. I'd sat with my own accountant, a woman I'd used for taxes for 15 years, and I had a full picture now. I had made decisions. I had updated documents. I'd also, and this was the part that took me the most time, written down what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. Loretta had left me a letter. It was in the same drawer as the bridal magazine clipping. I found it the same afternoon. I hadn't been able to read it for weeks. When I finally did, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. She wrote that she was proud of how we lived. She wrote that she was sorry she hadn't told me more. She wrote that she hoped I would do the things we'd always talked about and never done. The national parks, the coast of Maine, the train trip she'd read about, that goes from Chicago to Seattle. She said, "You are never small, Gil. Don't let anyone make you feel small." I read that line about 20 times. I didn't tell Brandon and Becca what Loretta had left. That wasn't their business, and more importantly, it wasn't the point. The point was not the money. The point was what I chose to do with whatever time I had. I started small. I took a week in October and drove through Vermont and New Hampshire by myself, the way I had driven routes for 30 years, steadily, without rushing, paying attention to what was around me. I stayed in a bed and breakfast one night that Loretta would have loved. I bought a postcard and put it in my jacket pocket and didn't send it anywhere. In December, I flew to Seattle for the first time in my life. I didn't tell Becca I was going. I told my brother. I stayed for 4 days, walked along the water, ate at places I'd never heard of, and stood on a ferry crossing Puget Sound in the November wind, feeling something I didn't have a word for. Something like reclaiming. When I came back, I called Becca and told her about the trip. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Dad, I didn't know you were going." "I know," I said. Another silence. She said, "Are you okay?" I told her the truth. "I'm better than I've been in a while." There was something in that silence. I don't know what exactly. Surprise, maybe. Or something dawning. She asked if she could come see me. I said of course. She came over on a Saturday without Brandon. She sat at the kitchen table and I made coffee and we talked for 3 hours. Really talked, the way we used to. She cried. I didn't. She said she was ashamed of how she'd handled things, how she'd let things go too far, how she'd sat across from me in that restaurant and let Brandon do most of the talking. She said she didn't know when she'd started doing that, letting other people do her talking. I didn't fill the silence with reassurance. I let her sit in it. Eventually she said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for all of it, including the wedding." I looked at her. "I know you are. Chad shouldn't have said that." "No," I said, "he shouldn't have." She looked at her hands. Brandon laughed. "I know he did." We sat there for a moment. I'm not going to tell you I forgave Brandon that afternoon, because I didn't. Forgiveness isn't a switch I can throw. What I can tell you is that I decided to stop waiting for anything from him. Permission, apology, acknowledgement. I didn't need it. Loretta had known that for decades. I was learning it late, but I was learning it. The following spring, I took the train trip. Chicago to Seattle, the Empire Builder. 2 nights on the rails through Montana, Idaho, the Cascades coming down into the coast. I had a small roomette and I watched the Great Plains go flat and dark outside the window the first night. And I thought about Loretta, and for the first time since she died, I thought about her without pain being the first thing. I thought about her and I smiled. There's a bend in the route somewhere in Montana where the river comes up alongside the tracks and runs parallel for a few miles. I had a cup of bad coffee from the dining car, and I watched that river in the early morning light, and I talked to her. Not out loud, but in the way I've always talked to her when no one else was listening. I told her she was right. About the money, about the patience, about all of it. I told her the rosebushes were coming in again. I told her I'd finally fixed the screen door. I told her I was okay. There was something I want to say clearly because I've thought about it a lot. I'm not a wealthy man in the way that Brandon's family uses that word. I live in the same house. I drive the same truck. I still watch what I spend and I don't buy things just to have them. But I am free in a way I don't think they understand. Free in a way that can't be pressured out of you or laughed away at a wedding toast. Loretta gave me that. She gave it to me over 30 years, one careful decision at a time, without asking for any recognition. I still have the cracked dress shoes. I keep them in the closet, not as some dramatic reminder, more as just evidence. Evidence that the day I wore them was one of the hardest days of my life, and I showed up anyway. Evidence that nobody in that ballroom knew the first real thing about me, or my wife, or what we had built together, quietly, in an ordinary house, over the course of an ordinary life. I'm no longer interested in explaining myself to people who never asked. Becca and I talk more now. Brandon and I are cordial. I am honest with myself about what that relationship is and what it isn't, and I have made my peace with that. My daughter knows who I am. She is finding her way back to herself, I think, slowly. The way you find your way back from a wrong turn, which is not with drama, but just by paying attention and making different choices one by one. Last fall, she called me on a Thursday evening, out of nowhere, and said, "Dad, do you want to go see the leaves in Vermont? I've never been." I said, "I know a good road." We went the following weekend. We drove through hills that were burning red and orange, and we didn't talk about Brandon or money or the wedding or any of it. We stopped at a diner on a 2-lane highway and ate eggs and toast, and she laughed at something I said, really laughed the way she used to. And I thought, there she is, there's my kid. The shoes are still in the closet. The rose bushes came back again this spring. I fixed the screen door. I've thought a lot about why things unfolded the way they did. Not in a bitter way. More the way you think about a road you've driven 100 times and suddenly notice every curve. Loretta didn't hide her savings to be secretive. She did it because she understood something that took me decades longer to see, that the people who shout the loudest about what they have are usually the ones most afraid of losing it. She was quiet because she was secure. There's a difference between those two things, and most people never figure out which side they're standing on. What happened at that wedding? Chad at the microphone, the laughter, Becca staring at the tablecloth. That wasn't an accident. It was the result of a long chain of small choices. Brandon had learned over years that nobody pushed back. Becca had learned over months that going along was easier than standing up. Chad had learned over a lifetime that cruelty dressed as a joke gets a pass if the room laughs. None of that happens in a single moment. It builds, quietly, the way interest builds. And eventually you end up in a ballroom watching a man mock your dead wife's husband at her daughter's wedding reception. The thing about actions is that they go somewhere. Every one of them. Chad's words didn't disappear into the air. They landed. And they told me everything I needed to know about who was in that room and what they valued. That information was worth something. What I'm most grateful for, and this took me a long time to say, is that Loretta raised me up by example without ever making a speech about it. She didn't lecture me about money or patience or dignity. She just practiced all three steadily for 30 years in a kitchen in eastern Pennsylvania, watching someone do the right thing quietly over and over when no one's giving them credit for it. That is an education that no school offers. I absorbed more from her than I ever realized while she was alive. I think about Gil at that reception table, sitting very still, feeling the duct tape on his shoe. I don't feel sorry for that man anymore. He was doing the right thing in the right way, showing up for his daughter on the hardest day of his life, not making a scene, not asking for sympathy, just holding himself together with the same quiet discipline Loretta had modeled for him. That took more strength than anything Brandon ever did in a boardroom. And Becca. I think about Becca most of all. She lost her way for a while, not because she was a bad person, but because she was a person. And people get turned around when they're trying to belong somewhere new. The important thing is, she found her way back. Not because I forced her to, because something in her still knew which direction was home. That drive through Vermont last fall, the red hills, the bad diner coffee, the way she laughed, I'll keep that. Whatever else the years bring, I'll keep that. I fixed the screen door. The rose bushes came back. I took the train through Montana and talked to my wife in the dark. None of that came from money. It came from the decision, made quietly and kept consistently, to live by what you actually believe instead of what other people expect you to perform. That's the whole story. That's the only lesson I've got.